Hey everybody, it's Irene with BrainStormAcres, and today I'm going to be doing a little painting. So the other day when I was talking about making flags and banners and such, I mentioned that one of the things you have to deal with if you use colored fabric is that sometimes it will fade. And I thought I'd share just a couple of things I figured out over the years. It is possible to buy fancy acrylics that are designed specifically for fabric paints they call them. But to be honest, I've always used just regular old acrylics, and we're not talking something fancy. We're not talking about the high-end artist variety. We're talking about the low-end variety, like Michaels sells. Liquitex makes, I think, 3 different levels, or they sell 3 different levels at Michaels. And that's pretty typical of what they sell. You'll have a super low-end one, you'll have a medium one, which I think is the basics, and then you'll have a higher-end one, which is designed to have usually smoother texture and just overall higher quality for people who are painting professionally. Now, I think I couldn't even tell you, this is probably, 4 or 5 years old, 10 years old, I don't know. I had old paint that was left over from when my son was in high school. He's in his mid-40s now. That he had left over from a project where he helped with painting a bunch of scenery and stuff for the high school, and then they said, here, take this old paint away, it's garbage. Well, the reality was that most of it was not garbage. It had just, it was bits and pieces and stuff, and they were just going to replace it. So, somewhere in the box, I still have that. Now, I've bought the small sets like this before. They're about this size. And they work fine too. But in terms of cost, definitely the bigger tubes, these are like 4 US ounces, yeah. So those will do you forever, just about. I mean, I've used all the painting I've done, and I think I'm about halfway through it. So when I do this, the big trick is I'm not going to glob on the paint. I am going to take some very scientific thing. This is the top of a yogurt container, a large yogurt container, the kind that you actually reseal. And I'm going to put some paint on here. I'm also going to have a little container that's going to be plain old water, so that if I feel like my paint is too thick, I can thin it out. So let me do that. I have a paper towel here. I just went and got some water out of the water filter in the kitchen. You don't need to have filtered water. It's just convenient. And I don't like to add too many more minerals to anything I do here. So all I'm going to do here is I'm going to make sure the paint hasn't separated. The nice thing about the jars is that you can sort of stir them. What I find with these is if you carefully, so as not to squeeze paint all around the room, squeeze out most of the air, because remember, I'm only got about a half a container here. Squeeze out most of the air, then snap it tightly. I can then mush it with my fingers. This does not tend to separate really badly, but if yours has, you can simply reconstitute it by mixing it back together. And if you feel like your paint is a little dry and you don't want to have to do the dry on a mix on a surface thing, you could also add clean water. Now, I do recommend really clean water. I'm always a skeptic when it comes to tap water, because tap water can be chemically treated enough that I like to be fussy. I mean, I'm doing something that I want to last for a long time. I want it to last for a long time. So I'm going to get my brush wet. I'm going to dip it in there, and I'm simply going to start scrubbing on the fabric lightly. And I'm watching to see the color, how much I'm applying. I don't want any globs. I'm not going for a perfect, like, brand new out of the box look for this. I'm looking for a slightly antique-y, weathered sort of a look. So if it's slightly mottled, I don't have to worry about that. If I had new cloth and I was trying to achieve that effect, I actually might use two different colors of red, or I might use a red mixed with a little bit of brown or something else like that, and not do it all at once. So in other words, I might do a background color that's like I'm doing here, where I'm just scrubbing on the fabric with a light coat, and then I might come back and just sort of almost add a wood grain to it in terms of the way I would scrub on the fabric. But that would give it sort of a distressed or, you know, older look. Like I say, I'm not trying to look like this came right out of a jewelry showroom. I'm trying to make it look a little bit more rustic, I guess you'd say. I'm going to be careful to remember what is wet and what is not. This paint will also dry slightly darker than it is right now. So if you're concerned, like if you've never tried a paint before, the ideal situation is actually to apply a light coat and wait to see how exactly it dries. I've been using the same color paint for quite a number of years, so I know how it's going to dry. And like I say, I'm not looking for a perfect, right new out of the box sort of look for this. I'm looking for more of a rustic sort of an appearance. I am being careful not to scribble on the white background. As I mentioned earlier, I always have been pretty good at coloring inside the lines. Doesn't mean I never make a mistake, but it means that if I'm taking it slow enough, the biggest thing is not rushing. I know that I have a lot of scrubbing with a paintbrush to date that I need to do, and the tendency is to want to rush it. Well, I know from experience, if I rush it, that's when I'm going to screw it up. So I'm much better off in terms of my eventual satisfaction with the project to take it a lot slower and not go crazy trying to rush through. I do have a larger brush that I could use, and if I were doing bigger sections, I may have one sign that I would actually use the larger brush on. But this is a relatively narrow strip right around the edge of an existing painted sign, and I don't want to screw it up. I don't want to have some big blob on here that's going to make it unusable, or that I'm going to have to try and repaint the background somehow to try and cover up that blob that I've made. Acrylic paint does wash out, but only to an extent, and the darker the color, the more likely that it's not going to completely come out. And, you know, how would I wash this so that I would only get the spot where I wanted it to come out, You know, it's not as easy as it sounds. If I had just plain rag, and I had gotten paint on a rag, that would be easy. I could dunk the whole rag in. I could, you know, scrub it good, blah, 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 soap and water, all that sort of stuff. It would be fine. But that's not the way this is. This is part of a sign. Most of it that I've done so far is perfect. Why would I want to screw up that? I'm also risking, if I were to try and clean up a little mess that I made, making something else run. And like I say, I'm pleased with that edge already, so why would I want to risk screwing it up? So be patient. Don't glob too much paint on there. You can see I'm getting it on my brush, but I'm not globbing so much that I'm getting either globs onto the canvas, which is what this is made out of, or accidentally risking dripping. God forbid we should drip on something. Now, what I have done here is I have large sheets of cardboard. Somewhere along the line over the course of the year, we will always get multiple boxes in that either can be cut flat to become large sheets of cardboard, or, you know, have an insert that's a fairly large sheet of cardboard or something like that. I tend to save at least a few of those. A lot of our bigger boxes have actually been used as bed coverings in the garden this year. But I always try and have some cardboard that is larger. I thought about using some smaller stuff that I currently have in the house from the relatively recently arrived packages. If I didn't have much to do, if I was just doing a small project, say smaller than this for instance, I probably would use a smaller box. But the reality is those boxes don't lay really flat, and I would wind up taping the various flaps and stuff to try to make them stay flat. There might be gaps between the flaps. I could put down newspaper if I had it, but to be honest, we very rarely get a newspaper here. So if you have newspaper is always a good bottom layer. I could get some drop cloth. I have some plastic drop cloth that's used for painting, like when you paint a wall or something like that. I could drag that out, but this is just such an easy solution for me. I have these big sheets of cardboard that live in my studio. They stand on edge, up against an edge of the studio, so they're not taking any massive amount of space. And when I need them, there they are. It makes it super easy to get there and cover up the table. I like the idea of having the cardboard actually provides a little padding, so I'm trying to really protect this tabletop. I don't have a craft environment that's unique, that's a room that can be stuffed away or something. I do have, if the weather was not awful, because it's headed for 100 again today outside. So it's not comfortable out there, and we're getting some very high wind gusts. That would make this a totally undoable project outside. You'd be getting dirt, blowing dirt into your paint, and blowing dirt will adhere to paint. So that's a no-no, and it would be just miserable out there. The bugs are biting terribly. Lots of bitey flies out there today. I know, because I walked the dog a couple of times this morning, and it was like, could you hurry up, dog, because I'm getting bitten. And that was, you know, fully dressed and all that kind of stuff. I was like just about ready to go get the bug spray. I don't have a dedicated location I could use. I could do it down in the studio. That would mean I would have to clear off a workbench. I really do not want to mess up the studio any more than it is already messed up right now, because I've got like 9 zillion projects going on down there to get ready for my show, and I just don't want to make it any more complicated down there, because that's too critical an area, and it's an area that has to have a certain amount of space between things in order for things to be safe when you're actually using, you know, hot items like 600-degree pewter or, you know, something like that. You don't want to be tripping over something where you were painting. So I could bring in a folding table here. There's already one folding table stashed in a corner here because of other projects that are being done. And there's another folding table that's currently being used as storage in another corner. So I really don't need to add to the chaos. I want to have a nice open flat spot. The ideal situation, if you don't have a dedicated spot, is a folding table. They sell them at every big box store and most of the office supply stores. Generally, the best prices are at the Sam's and Costco's of the world. I haven't priced them recently at Target or any of the other ones, Home Depot. I know I've seen Home Depot had some good sales. So, you know, it depends on what you've got going on in your area, what stores you have. But any of those places will sell usually 6-foot tables, sometimes 5-foot tables, and sometimes 4-foot tables. Now, the big advantage to the 4-foot tables is that most of them can be adjusted up to what they call countertop height or workbench height. So the 4-foot ones are usually adjustable in terms of height, whereas the 5- and 6-foot ones are usually not adjustable. when you're cooking in the kitchen, your counter is taller. And if you're going to be standing to do whatever you're doing, whether it's painting or cutting things or anything like that, having a taller work surface can save your back in a big way. So we have hauled in folding tables before. They are less than $100, sometimes way less, sometimes not as much less as you'd like them to be. But they allow you to move things around easily, to store things relatively easily. They'll fit into a closet because they fold up relatively thin. Some of the newer ones, like the 4-foot ones, they're probably less than 4 inches thick when you're done. And 4-foot is big enough for a lot of things. Now, not everything. I do some of my sewing projects and stuff. This table, which is easily seats 8, is not quite big enough. I used to have a girlfriend that I did sewing with all the time who had a gaming table 4x8 made from a 4x8 sheet of piece of plywood, and that was positively heavenly for doing all kinds of sewing and stuff on, because you could actually stick a table at a chair at one end, put a bolt of fabric on it, roll the bolt of fabric down the entire length of the table, do all the layout and pinning and everything else that you needed to do, and yeah, you weren't crowded at all. It was amazing how quickly you could get projects done because you weren't constantly fussing and having to readjust your fabric location. I am almost done with this project. I have been 3/4 of the way around now. Now, I'm not going to paint the back. If you were to see the back, you would be able to see that. Maybe I'll see if I can show it to you without making a mess at the end. The red stripe around the edge is very pale and nothingness. But that's not out towards the public. That is actually up against the pavilion that we have for our shop. So, not a biggie. Not a biggie. If I was being really fussy, I am doing kind of the edge of it a little bit, just so that it'll look nice, but I'm not worried about, like, oh, gee, I didn't wrap it completely, because this thing is going to be 7 feet in the air above the door, and you have to, you can worry yourself to death about some things, and this is just not one of the things that's worth worrying yourself to death about. I do try, when I'm working at something that somebody's going to have at eye height, to make sure that I am much more precise in my work, so that they're not going, ooh, that looks like a little ragged around the edges. But to be honest, most people don't notice. The only people who usually notice are people who are either into painting or who are being obnoxious. And the obnoxious people can just go away as far as I'm concerned. So I have other things to do other than listen to them. So I am almost done. Now, you may have noticed me check my arm before, because I realized I accidentally touched this here before, but it is dry enough that the paint is not coming off yet, or already, still even. Yeah, right, one of those words. So just in the time that it took me to go around the outside of this, the paint on this edge has already dried enough that it feels a little tacky to your arm, but it is not coming off. Now, we are hot and we are dry, so that makes it a little easier for that to happen. If I had been doing this in a damp, cooler environment, it might not have dried as quickly. But to be honest, acrylic dries relatively quickly to start with, in comparison to, say, oil, because acrylic is a water-based paint rather than an oil-based paint. And that's one of the nice things about it, is I just wash my brush in warm soapy water. Now, I'll show you how pale the back is on this. You can see how pale that is here. It's all faded, and the top edge is more faded than here because that's facing up towards the sun all the time. So yeah, it looks a little ragged, but this is looking way nicer. I'm going to go back a little bit one more time around just to look for what they call holidays. In other words, places that you've missed that you don't like the look of. Now, I may look at a spot and say, ooh, that looks nice. I like the way it makes it look kind of antique-y. Or I may look at a spot and say, well, it just looks like I missed something. Or, gee, everything around it is so nice, I'll just make that a little nicer. But that has given that a total spruce up in terms of its physical appearance. Now, the black letters are fine. If I was really concerned, I might touch them up a little bit. I don't know that I will. I don't want to mess them up. And I'm concerned that the black, which has kind of gone to a slightly charcoal color at this point, might require a complete, precise repaint in order to look good. And I don't want to have to do that. I can leave that for later, and if I decide it really needs it, I can do it. But I would rather keep it simple and be certain that I'm going to be able to complete tasks that are the most important in this project. And that's it. So much better. So much better. Look at that faded background. And there we are, nice and clean. So what I'm going to do is I have, I think 2 more signs that I'm going to touch up like that. And then I'm going to move on to another project that involves printing using, I just decided I would make this edge a little darker here. Printing using hand-cut blocks like that, stamps, that I made myself. Now you don't have to use hand-carved stamps. I just happened to want something that I couldn't buy a stamp for, and I wasn't going to pay somebody else to do it. So once again, I traced something, and I carved it out. And it was not brain surgery. It was simply another project that was done slowly and carefully. So until next time, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And you got to come see us again, because obviously we're going to be doing tons more. Oh, and don't forget to keep brainstorming, because obviously we are.